The cold night air carried a faint mist over the cemetery, wrapping around the headstones like a ghostly veil. The world was silent, except for the distant rustling of leaves and the occasional chirp of a lonely cricket. In the dim glow of the moon, a man stepped out of his luxury car, adjusting the sleeves of his tailored suit. His name was Daniel Carter, a self-made millionaire, the kind of man who had everything money could buy. Yet, as he stood there, staring into the darkness of the graveyard, something stirred inside him, a feeling he hadn't experienced in years. Curiosity, mixed with an uneasy sense of dread. He wasn't supposed to be here. He had only stopped by to visit his father's grave, a rare gesture for a man too busy chasing wealth to dwell on the past. But just as he was about to leave, a soft sound broke through the quiet, a muffled sob. His sharp eyes scanned the shadowed cemetery, searching for the source. Then, barely visible near an old moss-covered gravestone, he saw her, a girl, no older than 10, curled up against the stone, her small body trembling as she wept into her hands. Daniel hesitated. A part of him told him to ignore it. People had their own pain, their own losses. Who was he to interfere? But something about the way she sat there, completely alone in the middle of the night, sent a chill down his spine. Taking a slow, deliberate step forward, he cleared his throat. "Hey, kid, are you all right?" The girl didn't answer. Her sobs quieted, but she remained curled up, as if trying to disappear into the darkness. Daniel took another step closer. "It's late. You shouldn't be here alone." Still, she didn't move. The air felt heavier now, pressing against his chest with an unexplainable weight. He glanced around, searching for any sign of an adult nearby. Nothing, just the empty cemetery and the howling wind. A strange feeling crept over him, a feeling that something wasn't right. Taking a deep breath, he crouched down, careful not to startle her. "Listen, I don't know what happened, but you're not safe out here. Where are your parents?" At that, the girl finally lifted her head. Her eyes, wide, glassy, and filled with an unspeakable sadness, locked onto his. Daniel felt his throat tighten. Those eyes, they weren't just sad, they were haunted. She opened her mouth as if to say something, but no words came out, just a shaky breath, followed by fresh tears. Daniel frowned. Okay, it's all right. Just take your time." Still, she remained silent, staring at him with that same heartbreaking expression. Then, finally she whispered, "He said he would come back, but he never did." A cold shiver ran down Daniel's spine. "Who?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The girl's lips trembled. She looked past him, into the darkness beyond the cemetery gates, and then, in a voice so soft, it was almost lost in the wind, she said, "My father." Daniel's breath caught in his throat. Something in the way she said it, so raw, so hollow, made his chest tighten. The words lingered in the air between them, heavy and unresolved. He swallowed hard, suddenly feeling like he had stepped into something far deeper than he had ever intended. For a moment, Daniel didn't know what to say. The girl's voice had been barely above a whisper, but the weight of her words felt immense. The wind had picked up, rustling the trees and making the gravestones cast eerie, shifting shadows. He studied her closely. She looked pale, her small frame shivering in the cold. Her dark hair clung to her tear-streaked face, and her hands, tiny and fragile, were clenched in her lap. There was something deeply unsettling about seeing a child so utterly lost, sitting alone in a graveyard, long past midnight. "Your father," Daniel repeated slowly. "Where is he?" The girl hesitated, her fingers gripping the fabric of her dress. He promised he'd come back, she said, her voice shaking. But he never did. A strange heaviness settled in Daniel's chest. He wasn't sure if it was sympathy or something else, something deeper, more personal. He wasn't a man who let emotions get the best of him. But there was something about this girl that struck a nerve. He exhaled sharply, rubbing a hand over his jaw. All right, look. Maybe he got caught up with something. Do you have a phone? Someone I can call? The girl shook her head. No. Do you live nearby? Again, no answer. Just those big, sorrowful eyes staring at him like he was supposed to have all the answers. Daniel glanced around the cemetery. It was empty, quiet, too quiet. He didn't see a car, didn't hear any footsteps or voices. She was completely alone. Something was definitely wrong. He sighed, checking his watch. It was nearly 1 a.m. Whoever was supposed to be with her should have come looking for her by now, but they hadn't. You can't stay out here all night, he said finally. It's not safe. The girl lowered her gaze, her fingers tracing invisible patterns on the cold stone beside her. I don't have anywhere else to go. Her words hit him harder than he expected. Daniel knew what it was like to feel abandoned, to wait for someone who never showed up. He had been just a boy when his own father left, promising to return, promising to be there. But those promises had been empty, just like the silence that followed them. He swallowed back the memory and ran a hand through his hair. All right, he said, softer this time. What's your name? She hesitated before answering. Lena. Okay, Lena. He glanced around again, uneasy. You're not lost, are you? She shook her head slowly. No, I was waiting. For your dad? Lena's lip trembled, but she nodded. Daniel's jaw clenched. Something about this didn't sit right. A little girl, alone in a cemetery, waiting for a father who hadn't come back. It sounded like a story with a bad ending. He took a deep breath. Come on, let's get you somewhere safe. Lena flinched. I can't leave. Daniel frowned. Why not? She hesitated, staring at the gravestone beside her. For the first time, he noticed the name etched into the marble. James Calloway, beloved father. The date of death was 5 years ago. Daniel's heart stopped. His breath caught in his throat as he slowly turned back to the girl. Lena's fingers brushed against the name, her voice barely above a whisper. He told me to wait here. He said he'd come back for me. A cold shiver ran through Daniel's spine. 5 years. The man had been gone for 5 years. His mind raced, trying to make sense of what she was saying. She wasn't waiting for a father who had abandoned her. She was waiting for someone who couldn't come back. Daniel's throat tightened. Lena. He kept his voice calm, careful. When did you last see your dad? She didn't answer right. Away. Her small fingers traced over the name again, as if the stone itself could bring her comfort. A long time ago, she murmured. But I know he's coming back. He promised. Daniel exhaled, pressing his fingers against his temples. This was bad, really bad. This little girl wasn't just lost. She was holding on to something that wasn't real. His chest ached. He had spent his whole life burying the pain of broken promises. But seeing it now in this child made it feel fresh again. He swallowed hard. Lena, your dad. He hesitated, choosing his words carefully. He loved you very much. Her lower lip trembled. Then why hasn't he come back? Daniel felt like the air had been knocked from his lungs. There was no easy way to say it. No way to explain something like this to a child who still believed in impossible things. Lena, he said gently. Sometimes, when people go, they can't come back, even if they want to. Tears welled in her eyes. "But he promised," she whispered. "He promised." Daniel had no words. He had spent years building walls around himself, convincing himself that promises meant nothing, that people always left in the end. But right now, none of that mattered. Right now, all he saw was a little girl who was still waiting. A gust of wind howled through the cemetery, rattling the branches above them. The air felt heavier now, thick with something unspoken, and then, from somewhere in the distance, a sound echoed through the night, a footstep. Daniel's body tensed instantly. His eyes snapped toward the darkness beyond the gravestones. Someone was there, watching, waiting. Daniel's pulse quickened. The footstep had been faint, barely a whisper against the ground, but he had heard it. His eyes scanned the darkness beyond, the gravestones, his breath shallow. The wind carried an eerie stillness, as if the entire world was holding its breath. "Lena," he said quietly, shifting slightly in front of her. "Did you hear that?" The little girl nodded, gripping the edge of her dress tightly, but there was no fear in her eyes, only something strange, something almost expectant. Daniel's hands curled into fists. He wasn't the kind of man who believed in ghosts or the supernatural. Life had taught him that every mystery had a logical explanation. But right now, standing in the middle of a cemetery, with a little girl who claimed she was waiting for her father, a man who had been dead for 5 years, he wasn't sure what to believe. Then, the sound came again, this time, closer. Daniel spun around, his heart pounding. "Who's there?" His voice was firm, controlled. He was used to handling high-stakes business deals, used to standing his ground in boardrooms filled with ruthless competitors. But this was different. Silence. The wind picked up, rustling the trees, making shadows dance across the graves. Then, a figure emerged from the darkness. Daniel tensed. It was a man, tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in dark clothing. His steps were slow, deliberate, as if he had all the time in the world. Daniel took a step forward, shielding Lena instinctively. "Who are you?" he demanded. The man stopped just a few feet away. His face was partially hidden in the shadows, but there was something eerily familiar about him. Then, Lena's voice broke the silence. "Papa!" Daniel's blood ran cold. The man exhaled, softly, his gaze dropping to the little girl. "Lena," he murmured. His voice was deep, rough around the edges, filled with something Daniel couldn't quite place. Regret? Sadness? Daniel's mind raced. This couldn't be happening. James Calloway was dead. He had seen the name on the gravestone. "Lena," Daniel said carefully, not taking his eyes off the man. "Do you know him?" She nodded, stepping forward, slightly. "It's my dad," she whispered. Daniel's chest tightened. "That's not possible," he said, his voice firm, but uneasy. "Lena, your father, he promised." She interrupted. Her voice was soft, but certain. "He said he'd come back." The man, James, watched her with an expression that was impossible to read. "I never wanted to leave," he said quietly. "I swear to you, Lena." Daniel's mind screamed for logic, for reason, but as he stood there, watching the way Lena looked at the man, watching the raw emotion in his eyes, he couldn't ignore the weight of what was happening. James slowly knelt in front of his daughter. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I wanted to be here. I never meant to break my promise." Lena sniffled, her tiny hands reaching out as if afraid he would disappear. "I waited for you." James smiled sadly. "I know." The wind howled again, stronger this time, sending a chill through Daniel's bones. He didn't understand what he was witnessing, didn't know if he ever would, but something about it felt right. Lena stepped forward, reaching for her father's hand. Her small fingers met his, and for a brief moment, Daniel swore he saw something. Light, warmth, something unexplainable. Then, just as suddenly as he had appeared, James Calloway began to fade. Lena gasped, trying to hold on, but her father only smiled. "I love you, my little star," he whispered. "Always." And then, he was gone. The wind died down. The night was still once more. Lena stood frozen, staring at the spot where her father had been. Her small shoulders trembled, but she wasn't crying. Instead, she took a deep, steadying breath, as if something inside her had finally found peace. Daniel exhaled, realizing he had been holding his breath. His chest felt tight, his mind spinning with everything he had just seen. He wanted to question it, to make sense of it, but deep down, he knew some things couldn't be explained. He crouched beside Lena, his voice softer now. "You okay?" She looked up at him, her eyes still filled with sadness. But there was something else now, acceptance. She nodded. He kept his promise. Daniel swallowed hard. He wasn't sure what had just happened, but he knew one thing for certain. Lena didn't have to wait anymore. "Come on," he said gently, offering his hand. "Let's get you home." Lena hesitated for only a second before slipping her small hand into his, and together they walked away from the cemetery, leaving behind the past and stepping into whatever came next.